I believe, if I'm correct or not correct, I believe this is our last speaker, and this is a gentleman we've known for several years, and he's a fantastic researcher. His name is Brooks LaPlante. Brooks LaPlante is a former Indiana state legislator who has researched the JFK assassination for several decades. He owes his interest to the case to his Irish grandfather and to his mother, who was born on November 22nd. LaPlante spent most of his career as a manufacturing entrepreneur in the aluminum industry, and from 2005-2009 served on the Indiana State University Board of Trustees. In October of 2007, he had the opportunity to engage Vincent Bugliosi while the author was on the ISU campus to present his book, Reclaiming History. Perhaps he will share an interesting anecdote about that encounter. LaPlante has narrowed his research to the JFK medical evidence and to the Harvey and Lee duality as put forth by John Armstrong. His presentation is titled, Math Matters, the Origins of the Frontal Shots That Struck JFK. So, ladies and gentlemen, to our last speaker, please give a warm welcome to Brooks LaPlante.
As Casey said, I'm from Indiana. I live on the west side of Indianapolis. And if you go about 10 miles south of my house, you get to Plainfield. And that town is the home where James Tague grew up. You go another 30 miles from there, you go south to Martinsville, that's where Geneva Hine was from. She was in school, high school at Martinsville, a few years separate from John Wooden, went to Purdue, went to UCLA, was the best basketball coach we've ever known. If you get in your car and we hop in and we go 50 miles east, we get to Washington, Indiana. That is the home where Paul O'Neill grew up. Paul O'Neill, brain fart, baseball. Paul O'Connor, okay? So Paul O'Connor is from Washington. And John Ebersol, who was the radiologist at Bethesda, he went to undergrad at Indiana University and stayed and got his MD there as well. So there's 4 very important people in the JFK case that hail from Indiana. And so on behalf of the Hoosier State, I say welcome. Thank you to David Denton and the college here at Olney for hosting us. And this is one of the areas that I've done a lot of research. I've devoted myself for about the last decade between the 2 things that Casey talked about. In particular, I was driven into this by David Lifton, you know, supposedly the body switching, the decoy ambulance, the alterations before the actual autopsy, and the rest of it. This is a picture on Main Street of the motorcade. And from a tactical standpoint, with Kennedy sitting on the right and the back rear of the limo, you would put shooters behind him and to the right. Right front would even work. This is the route through Dealey Plaza. And what's interesting about Dealey Plaza, and I think most everybody here is aware of this, is it's perfectly symmetrical. We speak of the grassy knoll. Everybody talks about the grassy knoll, but there's really 2 knolls, and we've covered that in quite a bit today. And the south knoll is quite important in our analysis. Okay, in 1967, in January, there was a special report in Ramparts magazine by David Welsh, the associate editor, and David Lifton. He actually put this story in the UCLA daily paper, the Daily Bruin, on the 3rd anniversary. So it was published in November of '66. And they cite 3 assassins and the case for it. And they request that the investigation be reopened. Later that year, Josiah Thompson came out with 6 Seconds in Dallas. Same premise, 3 shooters. His scenario has 4 shots, and I don't have them in order because I separated the 2 from the 6th floor of the school book depository. But the shot that hit Kennedy in the back, Tink Thompson has it coming from the depository. Connolly was hit shortly thereafter, and in such a short time interval that there was no way that that shot came from the school book depository by the same shooter. So he has it also because of the angle down in the Connolly. He has it coming from the county annex roof. Shot 3 hit Kennedy in the back of the head from the school book depository, nearly simultaneous with a shot from behind the knoll, which hit him on the right side of the head. So those are Tink's 4 shots. What followed from that, and even we see it today, and I'm probably going to be guilty of giving you my version of things, but this leads people to really open up their imagination and really start to, and it's like solving a puzzle. It actually is very intriguing. It's one of the many rabbit holes that we get drawn into with the case. I'm going to show you a couple examples here. Here is one where Kennedy is hit in the throat from the south knoll. Not David's position, but close. And then hit simultaneously in the head, front and back. This is analysis by engineer Don Roberdeau, who, and it's, I wanted to give you the whole thing. It's hard to see, but he has, he's identified 6 shooting positions from the rear and 4 from in front. So he's got 10 possibilities. This is an analysis that Tim Nicholson gave me at Lancer back, I think, in 2016. He has 3 from the school book depository, although I think one of them is from the 3rd floor, 1 from the behind the North Knoll fence, and then he has a 5th shot. George Hickey shoots JFK from the Queen Mary. Well, I'll digress for a second. Paul O'Connor, who went to Washington High School, a few years before Paul, there was a graduate there who got an appointment to Annapolis. He was the nephew of Vernon Poindexter. Vernon was the mortician that Paul went to work for at age 14. The funeral home is literally 1 block out from the front of Washington High School. Vernon's nephew, John, became the head of the NSA, and we all know that he was involved in Iran-Contra, so it's a small world when you consider where people come from. So on this slide, this is the Charles Bronson video, and I think it's around 3:12, give or take a few frames. Bill Newman, you can see him right at the bumper of the car. He's under the yellow dot, and in this frame, you can see Hickey's got his gun pretty much, and we've seen some other shots today. His gun is basically pointed straight up in the air. So he would have to be faster than Billy the Kid and extremely accurate to take that weapon and lower it in, what, 1/10 of a second? Didn't happen. As you go through people's basic interpretations and theories about where shooters were and where shots came from, I've kind of presented them and I've grouped them here. Let's start on the lower left. There is a storm drain at the very end of the north side of the triple underpass. Actually, it's where the fence starts. There's a little break in the fence angle there. You're familiar, a lot of you know that it's there. It's at grade back there. There's a theory that a shooter basically came up through the storm drain, little opening in the fence, had a good shot angle. The next one up is S.M. Holland's position, where they found footprints and cigarette butts. At the corner is would be Badge Man. Then you get up to the upper oval. You've got several, you got 2 people on the 6th floor, 1 on the west end, 1 on the east end. That was Arnold Rowland said he saw 2 people up there at the same time. And the guy on the east end actually had a rifle, and this was around 12:15. And there are also some possibilities from a lower floor. Right next to that Oswald perch, they're almost side by side. That's the 2nd floor window, the notorious window in the Dowtex building. We see that in Oliver Stone's JFK. There could be upper floor shooters. There could be somebody on the roof. The blue dot over to the far right is the Dallas Annex building, county annex. There could be a shooter on the roof. Over on the south knoll, we have the match. There was a storm drain there that matches the one on the north knoll, but it's been covered up now. It's been closed, but there was a drain over there. And there could be a shooter somewhere. There was no fence over there, as we saw in the Cancelleri photo, but there were a lot of cars parked there. A great place to put a shooter would actually be just put him in the car, have him sitting there, and he can fire from a sitting position if he wanted to from the south node. And then I've identified not only the Elm Street drain, which has gotten a lot of scrutiny over the years, but the Main Street drain. And we're going to get into that here shortly. Sherry Feaster, in her book, pointed us to the south node. She did an excellent job making a case that there could be a shooter over there. I agree with David's comments today. There was total obstruction. I did the same thing that you actually did. I stood almost in that same spot at the 50th anniversary in 2013, and I took a photo. I didn't put it in this presentation, but there's no way you can make a shot from over there without going through the windshield. Now notice, and this is from my mathematics that I've done, and you'll see this shortly, where the limo was, the black dot at 313, it actually just comes into range where you don't have to shoot through the windshield from those storm drains. You can come in through the side window, and you're going to see it. In addition to Zapruder, we've got the Muchmore film, and we've got Nix and Bronson, who were very close to one another over by Main Street. And so those are the angles of the film, and we can compare those videos. Unfortunately, Bronson was just a very short clip. Mary Mormon is that little yellow dot that you see on the Muchmore line as it comes towards the limo. Here's some frame comparisons. Again, Marie Muchmore's video, that's Mary Mormon in the yellow dot. That's her famous picture on the right. Orville Nix was actually shooting. He had the camera tilted so far that when you look at his video, the limo looks like it's going uphill. Bronson has it pretty close. His camera's pretty close to level, I think, as was Muchmore's. The problem is, look in the Bronson frame on the lower right. That's Main Street, and there's distortion. Robert Groven would be a real expert to bring up here and talk about this type of thing, but depending upon where you are and how close to the image and whatnot, you do get this distortion. But far away, you get a better perspective of whether or not you're level in the true angle. Okay. In Doug Horn's 5 volumes on the ARB, chapter 14, which is in volume 4, he spends close to 200 pages talking about the Zapruder film. Is it real, or is the one that we know of, has it been altered? For our purposes in this analysis, we don't need to solve that question. He made the case that on November 23rd, there was a set that was made by a team led by Dino Brugioni. That set is missing. There was another set made on Sunday the 24th by Homer McMahon. That is in the National Archives. And what they did, this is like a science fair project. So these are 36 by 36 with a hinge in the middle. They just put a bunch of 5x7s up there. And what is in the McMahon board in the archives matches the frames in the Zapruder film as we know it. But the most important thing, I think, that I took from the 200 pages is he said there was not enough time to do a complicated mat insertion where you have traveling mats, and what you're basically, it's like a theater set. You've got in the background, you've got the set, and up front, you've got the actors and whatnot. And so in mat insertion, you play with what's in the front versus what's in the back. And he said there simply wasn't enough time. It's a very complicated procedure. The other one is aerial photography, which basically you're just painting on something onto the existing image. What he says is you project that frame onto glass, and then you just come up and you paint what you want, and then you take a photo of it. And so what we know, we have viewing boards in the archives that match the Zapruder film, and the limo is where it actually was. There may be alterations in the film where things were painted on, but the limo was where it was. So we don't need to solve that debate. The other thing is when you look at Zapruder, and you can follow it all the way through, go to the Costello edit, look at all the frames. I mean, he's panning the limo as it's coming down the street, and it almost drops out of view in the bottom of some of the frames. And it's not level. So one of the things I did, is I made an adjustment. This shows the grade. The frame at the bottom has been adjusted. It's 3 degrees, 9 minutes, roughly, is what the slope is on elm. Now, again, you're just basically seeing this image in a flat frame. Zapruder is up on the pedestal. He's shooting down at about a 10-degree angle. Okay, so there is a little bit of distortion when you're not viewing exactly level, but it's not much because, again, he's only at a 10-degree angle. The point is here, with it being leveled, the black line on the horizontal, I drew the red line above it, those are level on the horizontal. In essence, the shot has got to come over the top of not only the windshield, but I think through the visors, because the visors were up, and there's a very narrow gap, in fact, I think we'll see it in the Altgens photo. It's a very narrow gap. So unless you want to shoot to the windshield, you've got to be high enough up to clear that. This is simple math. This is rise to run. This is trigonometry. And basically, you take the ratio. So if you're 200 feet or 300 feet of the limo over on the far right, you've got to be at height H2. It's a simple ratio. And so when you do that, the math I get is you've got to be, if you were in the position today that David showed us, with a guy kneeling over on the top of the underpass, you literally have to be more than 15 feet. You have to be on top of a panel truck to be able to clear the windshield. Okay. The alignment of the limousine was almost, for all practical purposes, it was parallel to Zapruder's position. So if I'm Abraham Zapruder, the limo's heading is basically parallel to my position in the road. However, analysis that was done by the HSCA and confirmed by others basically has JFK's head turned away from Zapruder 25 degrees roughly. So he is looking basically where that yellow arrow is. Okay, the limo's actually headed right to the very corner of the triple underpass at Commerce, and he's looking where the yellow arrow is. And I've got the Main Street storm drain circled there in red. And so shooter there is basically almost shooting head on towards Kennedy. This is the blackout due to the windshield again. Okay, so I take that zone where the windshield would have been in the way, and you can see not only the storm drain on Main, but the shooter position up on the knoll actually can come in sideways to the limo. And again, you'd have to, if you were, for example, in this position, you'd have to be more than 15 feet above grade to shoot to the windshield. Okay, this is something that I ran across a couple years ago.
Hey, Brooks? Where you just had that up there on the screen, are you saying that's where the limousine was at during the throat shot or headshot?
No, everything I'm doing is headshot.
Okay.
I'm not doing anything on the throat shot. I have a theory about that I'm working on, and I might mention something about that at the end, but that's not part of this presentation. Okay, so I was Googling around one evening a while back, a couple years ago, and I ran across a master's thesis that was done by a student, Henry Lambert, at UCLA of all places, the Department of Criminal Justice. He did this back in 1994. And the premise of what he was studying is what happens if you have a hostage situation and you have to call in SWAT. And there's a bank across the street, the guy's already shot the security guard, and he's acting crazy, and you may have to take him out. But you've got to shoot through a storefront, through a plate glass window. And so I will make this available. Anyone wants to read this thesis, it gets pretty technical. But he had a lot of help, with a military base where he did a lot of the experimentation. He used soft nose, full metal jacket, variety of bullets, variety of weapons, very, very comprehensive tests. And this last line, he wanted to study and quantify deflection, stability, fragmentation, and lethality. In this case, he was really interested in the .308 caliber full metal jacket bullet. Okay, what he found is when the bullets impacted the glass, the tip was severed right off. The remaining nose mushroomed. So the bullet's deforming. And as it passes through the glass, it separates. And the jacket, he says it's a parachute-like piece of copper. It basically separates off. And so you've got separate lethal fragments that are now flying through the air. In all cases, the bullets experience tumble. So I think that video that David showed, in fact, I thought it'd be interesting, David, in terms of a scale. I thought that little hole that was in the headrest or whatever you showed, that to me looked to be very, very small. I don't know if that was enlarged a little bit or.
It was definitely zoomed in, but that came from the 22.
Okay. Now, what he basically did is he quantified the amount of deflection, and he creates a little chart in this thesis. So if you have a SWAT team there, you know, it's like windage and bullet drop and all of that, you know, you get your little chart out and say, I'm going to have to aim about 10 inches to the right, so when this goes through the glass, because I'm shooting at a 28-degree angle, the bullet's going to do this. And I'm going to have to shoot a little bit high, too, because I'm coming down with an angle of incidence. But the bottom line is that the bullet deforms, the bullet tumbles. So the idea of that bullet going and making a pristine hole in the neck is highly questionable. Plus, even though the windshield wasn't bulletproof, it was double pane glass. So that would be something for us to follow up as researchers. Look at the technical aspects, whatever we can find on that windshield. But above and beyond all of this, as in terms of discussion, I think anybody that was shooting at the president, and I think there were a bunch of them, probably 5 or 6 guys in different positions, as we'll see. These guys were pros. They were the best, okay? I can guarantee you what didn't happen is they didn't have a bunch of guys meet down in Harlandale on Thursday night for beer and barbecue and pull numbers out of a hat to figure who was going to get to shoot at JFK the next day. Okay, that didn't happen. It was well planned. These were pros. Did it involve a guy like Swetra? Did it involve the best of the best from the U.S. military? CIA guys who were former military snipers? Whoever they were the best of the best. Okay. For our study, these are the things that we have to do, and they're logical. We have to figure out where was JFK's head position at 313. What's the actual location and what was the orientation? We have some of that information. We have to look at which bullet are we talking about. Is it the bullet that hits here? Is it the bullet that hits here? Is it the bullet hits in the back of the head? Determine the corresponding path and trajectory angles based on where we're shooting from as we do the analysis. Is there anything that would obstruct the bullet's path, like the windshield? If you shot a low trajectory shot from behind the president, okay, depending upon where you're shooting, if you're shooting from low, Daltex 2, the beauty of that shot is the agents on the running boards are not in the way because it's a shot right over the limo. The question is, are you up high enough at 313 to clear the windshield? We'll look at that. And then you tie all of this stuff to the known damage on the head, which we're going to define, and you have to get into the discussion of forward spatter, because that's a critical element. And we'll talk about spatter. As part of my research, and which really kind of dovetails into this, these are some of the books that I've read. I don't want to upset anybody in the room, but I know Harrison Livingstone got pretty nasty in his book. In fact, I would say at some point it was total carnage. He was really disrespectful of all the people that do research. We're not going to agree, okay? We're all going to make mistakes. None of us are perfect. I disagree with, what's that?
Except Harry.
Except Harry. Now, I disagree with David, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but he's helped me to look at some things had he not made this presentation, which I've seen before. If Sherry Feaster had not written that book and planted those thoughts out there. Now, she makes a critical mistake, and we talked to her about it at Lancer. She basically says if you're standing over on the triple underpass at grade, you could actually clear the windshield. But she didn't do the math. She didn't do that rise to run that I showed you about. And that was the one mistake that she had in her book. You'd have to go through the windshield if you were standing over there at grade. Okay, with all of this, I've got, of course, we've got David Mantik's 2015 piece there, which has been really informative. And Mike Chesser, a neurologist, has done a lot of good follow-up on that. And he's been to the archives, and he's provided some really good input. Okay, chapter 6 of Livingstone's book. That, to me, was the mother lode. And Diana Bowen and Margaret Hinchcliffe were the two nurses that after they cleared the room, after he's pronounced dead, they cleaned JFK's body. And she goes into great detail in this book, in this chapter, about what she saw, what she did. And she drew this diagram. She's got the hole in the lower back right, which everybody at Parkland pretty much agrees there's this massive hole back here, okay? That's known. But then she told them how much the brain was missing. And it was substantial. And you have pieces, you have doctors like McClellan and others who thought they saw cerebellum actually dropping, because Kennedy's on his back in the ER, and there's still brain matter that's falling out of the skull. First thing they did is they did cut downs. They started pumping Ringer's lactate into him, and then blood transfusion that followed. So they're pumping him full of liquids. At the same time, he's got this hole in the back of his head. So they're pumping this stuff up. It ends up all over the floor. They're having to throw sheets down and everything. It was a total mess. So as part of her cleanup, what she did is she took some type of a hospital towel or whatnot and actually stuck it in there until it got like soaked up and whatnot, and then threw that into the linenscape. And then packed this head with gauze squares. So she had her fingers in the hole for probably 2 minutes, just stuffing gauze squares in there. The other thing that she said that was really significant is not only was there bone missing, the scalp is gone. She says she's got there's a hole like this, and she says the scalp may be overhung in a few areas, but basically it kind of followed the perimeter of the wound. So it's gone. And last but not, she didn't wash the hair. She used swabs to get some of the big clots. She didn't notice any other wounds. So I'm guessing this hole that we're going to look at in a minute in the forehead, I think it was probably, it was matted down. There was probably just kind of stuck there with some blood and whatnot. And they didn't touch it. She didn't see it. Didn't notice anything else abnormal on the head. Okay. Autopsy photos and x-rays. These are two photos showing the back of the head, and we know these have been doctored because the hole's not there. We're going to enlarge the one on the left, and what's interesting is this is the flap that everybody talks about, and we think we see it in the Zapruder film. Flap swings open. In fact, if you actually watch the film and not Costello's edit where you go frame by frame, you actually can see at some point what looks like jello just drops out of the head. You can see it on the Zapruder film. So either this flap is real or it's an artifact that's been created after the body left Parkland. Now, the interesting thing, if you could really look closely, I think the flap, Kennedy's virtually face down on the morgue table. This flap is not sticking out sideways. It's actually down, okay? It's down. And you can see the end of the flap where it's actually the last crack, that wider portion along that yellow line that I've drawn. And that's what I would call the hinge. And the only reason it hasn't totally fallen off is the scalp's still attached. That's what's keeping it in place. That red circle appears to be a notch. So I take that photo, I take the lateral x-ray, and I take the HCSA diagram, and I size them and kind of lay them side by side. And as I was working on this, I noticed, see that distinct flat area on the x-ray right by the yellow line? All I did is take that yellow line in the photo and drag it over. Just dragged it over, it's the same size. I think that's where the break is, where that flap breaks from the skull. Now, whether it's hanging down in the x-ray or it's actually been removed, we don't know. But there's a big void area up there. It's missing bone, missing scalp, and that's caused because that flap is hanging down. Now, when you swing that flap back up, that little notch that we see on the left up there, it raises up into where I have the red circle on the x-ray, which just happens to coincide where the HSCA had the exit wound. And it is right on that suture line between the parietal and the frontal bones. The frontal bone is in green. That's the suture line. That's where they had the wound. And I think that's what we're looking at. Now, one thing that bothers David Mantic is the bullet particles that you see up in the upper part of the brain in that long rectangle, that long dotted blue rectangle. And that trajectory, he feels, has to emanate from the frontal headshot. In other words, the bullet came in, it fragmented, and those particles went shooting up along towards the back of the head. But they're so high up in the skull, he says it only can be explained by a frontal shot. The blue arrow is the location of the 7 by 2 millimeter fragment. You can see it if you really zoom in on the x-ray, you can see that fragment. He's identified, Mantic's identified that, says that's the fragment. That was found by Dr. Humes and removed at the autopsy. The entry hole is in the upper right hairline up here, above the outer edge of the right eye, up in the hairline, is in the red circle. Okay. And of course, in the back of the skull, where there should be a massive dark area because there's missing bone, is that famous white patch. When they tested it with optical density reading, they were able to prove that it was fake. This is the frontal x-ray. The head is tilted slightly back. The AP view confirms that there's missing bone and brain on the right side. That 7 by 2 fragment, it's about 3/4 of an inch above the right eyebrow. So it's about right here is where that, and it's right inside on the back side of the frontal bone. The infamous fake 6.5 millimeter artifact, the yellow arrow, that was planted when they reshot the x-ray. What's interesting is the fragments at the top, although on the lateral they look like they go straight back, and in this AP, they're actually spread out kind of side to side. Okay, the forehead wound. These are two pictures. The one on the right, I think the photographer is basically standing right about Kennedy's, at least to his shoulder, if not right up by the ear. So he's basically just shooting right on top of the head. The one on the left, he's probably down maybe midline in the torso, and he's shooting at an angle. And when you, and what's interesting is you can see in both frames, you can see a little tiny dark spot, that's the yellow arrow. Above it is what I think is the bullet hole, the blue arrow. And here, you zoom in a little bit here. Is that the arrow? I mean, is that the bullet hole up there? What's interesting is there are pictures of JFK where you can see this hole that were seen by Bruce Pitzer, Dennis David, Joe O'Donnell, Robert Knudsen, the White House photographer, saw this image. Sandra Spencer actually developed a film at the Navy lab, developed a film that showed this hole. The difference is the picture that she has doesn't look like the one on the right. The one that she has is, it's probably after the restoration and cosmetics have been done, and Kennedy's laying on the table. He's covered with a sheet. You can see the neck wound, and you can see this clear hole in the forehead. His eyes are closed. She said it looked very, almost like he was sleeping, you know, very, not upsetting. It wasn't distasteful in any way. Probably they were nearly done with the cosmetics. The throat wound wasn't sutured up yet. One thing that Tom Robinson, the mortician, said is after they sutured the throat wound, he covered it with dermal wax to make sure there would be no leaking, okay? Which leads me to the question, This incision, this notch in the upper left, you can see that famous V notch, that incision that was made up there, that would have had to have been closed and sutured. He wasn't asked, when the ARB had Robinson in for interview, they never talked about that incision. Robinson didn't offer anything. He did say he plugged the hole with wax. He remembers the hole distinctly. He plugged it with wax. So if they covered the sutures in the throat, when they closed up that incision up here with sutures, that would have been wax too. And something I'll mention a little bit later, there were little cracks in the skin in the cheek that Robinson had to put. He noticed embalming fluid that was seeping out of a few cracks in the cheek, so he sealed that with wax. So wax, wax, wax on the incision. When they opened the casket for viewing in the East Room, Jackie thought he looked like a wax dummy. Supposedly he didn't look that bad. I think the people from Gallers thought they did a pretty good job. She just didn't like his appearance. And so there was a discussion, they decided to keep the casket closed. So there was definitely a lot of wax applied. Here's my question. If they had stitched up this incision and put wax over it, why does Robinson not mention that? He talks about the hole being distinct. He says, I just plugged the hole. So that makes me believe the hole is not part of the incision, which I think supports what we see on the photo. Okay, Kellerman went up and got Clint Hill. He was up in the tower with Jackie. Went up and got him about 2:30, brings him down to the morgue to view the wounds. If I was Clint, I would say, I've seen the wounds up close and personal. I was the first guy to see him because I was in the car riding to Parkland. But they brought him down, I think, to see exactly what is in that photo that Sandra Spencer developed. So here's my question. If he shot in the back of the head, bullets coming forward, why not just say, hey, we found a hole up here. It's an exit wound caused by a small fragment. Why not address it? They never talk about it. Warren Commission on the left. The problem is when they took a close look at that from the House Select Committee, they realized the angle didn't work. So they had to move the entrance wound up. The original wound is the yellow circle. Oh, sorry about that. It's the yellow circle down by the external occipital protuberance. I'll just call it EOP from now on. So it's down right in the vicinity of the EOP. They moved it up about 10 centimeters. Here's an illustration of what they did. And the reason they did it is they need the angle to be able to work so that when that bullet came, and I have the head level here on the right, but actually he's tilting forward, so they needed to make the angle work so that shot was feasible. However, the Bethesda doctors had it down by the EOP, and to this day, Doug Horn and David Mantic say there's an entrance, as we'll see in a minute, down there. So they agree with the original position that Bethesda doctors had. David did a very good job, Mantic did a good job of analyzing this photo and kind of telling us what the alignment is. The center line is that little skinny diagonal blue line. He has down in the circle, that's where the Harper fragment is. It's way down in the very bottom. That's the position. That red arrow, that is that upper hole. That's the HSCA, House Select Committee's entrance. When they moved it from down below, they moved it up to the red arrow. But when you look at the beveling, that looks like an exit wound based on the way the beveling is going. But they said it was an entrance. Here's David's drawing. And the reason he has the Harpert fragment, and there's been a real argument, and even among experienced radiologists and professionals in the medical community, of where is the Harper fragment. David thinks it's totally occipital. Some people have it higher. This is where he's got it. But that little notch down at the very bottom had lead particles, and you actually can see it in the X-ray of the Harper fragment. So if the Harper fragment is truly there, in the lower part, mainly occipital down there, and there are lead particles down there, you've got a wound there caused by something. David says that was entrance. That's what the Bethesda doctors had originally. The wound was there. Doug Horn agrees. But then you got the problem with the red dot above. All right, to summarize all that, whatever JFK looked like when he left Parkland, the head that we see in the photos and x-rays doesn't compare. It's been altered. Now the debate, and I spent a lot of time talking with Rick Russo and some other researchers on this, is where did it happen, okay? Lifton never really solves that problem. He addresses the ambulance shuffle and the 3 casket deliveries and everything, but I mean, did it happen across the street in the animal vivarium where they had a morgue over there? Did it happen off-site? There's 3 potential sites that have been offered for where they could have done the alteration, Walter Reed being one. There was a joint military site, I forget the name of it, not too far away, but I don't want to get into that because that's a whole nother presentation, but there are several possibilities. But the main premise is the body was removed immediately off of Air Force One, taken by a helicopter that departed inside of 2 minutes, was flown somewhere, alterations done, brought to the hospital around 6:35 in a plain shipping casket with turnbuckles. They opened it up and he was in a body bag, okay? And there's a lot of agreement on that. And I'll make one other comment. I have found through my research that there was a body bag that was brought in by the Gallers people into Parkland. And there's a Texas congressman who's on the record saying he saw it. Just the back or with the body? When they brought the casket in, when they unloaded the casket and they brought it into the ER so O'Neill could put JFK in the casket. I don't know if it was Peanuts, if it was Aubrey, maybe O'Neill himself had it. Somebody had a body bag, okay? And this Texas congressman told that story to William Manchester. And I know because I've been to Wesleyan University in Massachusetts to read all the interviews that he did. And I read the one that he did with this Texas congressman. And he says they brought in a black bag. Okay. A lot of people are familiar with the Belmont memo. This came out sometime early evening. Belmont's talked to Gordon Shanklin. They've already got 1 bullet, and there's another one stuck behind the president's ear. And then there's some notation that's made at 9:18. I think that might have been the time of the phone call that he made to Shanklin. I just offer this. There's all sorts of stuff out there that you can look at. Now, we don't know what kind of bullets, were they fully jacketed, were they soft point? You know, there's some conjecture somebody used a mercury bullet. I guarantee you these pros, they used the weapons of their own choosing. Whatever they were comfortable with, that's what they went with. What type of bullet? That's guesswork. But this is interesting. This is something I want to talk about. And particularly in light of what we know about the experiment that Lambert did shooting through glass. This frontal bone is hard, it's dense. The occipital bone, entry back there, those are very thick bones. Compare that to 1/4-inch tempered glass, I don't know. But those bullets are probably going to do something like this. And if it's a soft point, they're definitely going to do something like this. And that bullet enters, and all of a sudden, it creates tremendous disruption. There's a phenomenon called cavitation. And what happens when this bullet comes in? It just creates, as it arrives at the back of the skull, there's this cone spreads out. So when it gets to the back of the skull, all of this is impacting on the back of the skull with tremendous force. And I've actually done some research on this that I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so what do we have on the head wounds? We have got the wounds in the back that I've already talked about, including the blowout. And then we've got 3 things that we see in front. We've got the exit wound that the House Select Committee has. We've got this mysterious wound in the forehead at the hairline. And then we have evidence of a wound in the temple area above the right ear, or maybe above and slightly to the right, but it's in this region, okay? The House Select Committee exit is up here. The forehead entry is down over here. These look like 3 distinct wounds. Now the question is, and Mike Chesser actually went to the archives recently, looked at x-rays, and he found in that big blue circle he found the notch in the skull that correlates to the temple wound. But I haven't seen where he's precisely located that, and that would be a very, very important piece of information. Is it possible that that wound on the temporal area is conflated or mixed up with the wound up here on the suture line for the House Select Committee? Are they distinct? Are they really the same? At the autopsy, Fink was standing up near the head. Jenkins was on his right shoulder, okay? And they're on JFK's anatomical right. So they're looking, they both saw this wound. Fink made a comment about it, that he saw this wound in the temporal area, and there was like a lead smudge that he saw.
For 5 minutes, okay?
I need more time, David. I'll go as fast as I can.
We're really running behind.
I'm going to go as fast as I can. Okay. Possible shots from the right front. Okay, these are various angles. One thing I'm going to point you out to is that oval that you see, okay? I've enlarged JFK's head just for visual purposes, and I put it on the line of sight. The position is that dotted line, so he's looking over towards the south knoll. And I moved that temple, the entry point of the temple, I moved it right over the X. So that's where I've got the temple, right on the X, and these angles. Now, what's interesting is the red line from the Elm Street drain, that's a 45-degree angle into the temple. As you swing up the fence line, it gets more direct, and if you shoot from Badgeman's location, it's a perpendicular shot. So if you shoot him in the temple, it comes out by the left ear. So those shots are basically all eliminated. The only one that really makes sense, you could argue, is the storm drain on Elm, possibly the one over here up that first yellow line on the left, possibly, depending upon if there was a little bit of deflection. Okay, the shot to the forehead, I did the same analysis. I moved the head back, so the entry wound up here is now on the X. You can see how I moved the oval. The angles are all still the same. All these bullets go across to the left side of the skull. So there's no way you could have shot him, made a frontal shot from there. Okay, so there's two possibilities. Storm drain on Main Street. They closed off Main. There's no cars on Main. There's nothing to really obstruct him. That angle is slightly upward. If he's over on the south knoll in a car or over back behind a tree, it's slightly downward. Now, here's a key question. Relative to the center line of the car, where is Kennedy's head? How far over is he leaning? Okay? And they measured the XYZ of the head, but he has a back brace on. If he didn't have the back brace on, he might have survived. But it's keeping him, he's tilting, he's listing like a ship, but he's being held upright by the back brace. But you can see in Mormon, he's really leaning over to his left. The other thing I found in Much More, this is very critical, it's the only film where you can see the stripes in the road. They're vague, but you can see the little white stripes. So we know he's pretty much in the center line of the road. Okay, position really matters. Where's the head? On the top, I have him short of the center line. In the bottom, I've moved the head. I'm tilting so far that his head is actually over by the center line of the car. And when you do these, I know the dimensions of the car. I can calculate angles. All right, position number one. He's not leaning all the way over to the center line of the car. In order to miss the windshield and not hit the side little window that's behind Greer's shoulder, there's a little side window by the support for the bubble top. To miss that, this is the angle. It's 28 degrees to 37 degrees. I've taken it back on the right to be able to shoot through that side window, okay? And you're going to see a picture of what this actually looks like in a second with the actual car. To shoot through that side window, you'd have to be where the red oval is, okay? And you could see that black line next to the oval there. It basically almost passes over the storm drain on Main. So that shot can't be made from the storm drain based on these numbers. Now, I moved Kennedy right over to the center line of the car, rerun the math. That angle changes to 24 degrees to 31.3. Look where the red lines are. That narrow cone actually includes the storm drain. So it's right at that point. If Kennedy's head is actually leaning all over, so it's at the center line, that shot can be made from the storm drain on Main Street. Okay, tilt of the head forward. This is something I just wanted to comment because I talked about the particles that Mantic saw in the upper head. You have to tilt the head forward. This kind of matches up with what you see in Zapruder, right? He's really like this. He's not upright like this. He's like that. Okay, it's a 60-degree angle. That's perplexing to me. Of how you might understand 45, but that's perplexing. Okay, the 4 viable frontal shots, whether they be forehead or temple, these are the measurements for anybody who's interested in that. The Elm Street storm drain was 79 feet. The Main Street was 175. Why would you put shooters in the storm drains? They're the shooters of last resort. Good, they've got cover, they can get out. What if they want to shoot at Kennedy when he's further down on Elm? Be a perfect place to be. He's lower, they've got great angle, they got great sight, line of sight. Okay, the trajectory from Main Street, this is a history photo that I saw that I pulled up. It's basically right around the assassination. You can see the flowers and the crowds and everything. This is the trajectory I put on there from Main Street, from the storm drain. Okay, now you go to Z348, you see alt-gens, you see the people standing around him. That yellow stripe where the yellow arrow is, that yellow stripe, that we know where Zapruder was, where alt-gens was. He's standing just a couple feet up from the yellow stripe. You enlarge that period photo, you can see where the yellow stripe is on the right. That's alt-gens in the green. The guy who is hitting the deck right behind him, the bullet passes pretty close to him if it's coming from the storm drain on Main, within a few feet on his left side. Everybody else in that photo, the other blue dots, you can see where they are. Now, this is the trajectory of the bullet. Alt-gens is the green dot. The guy to his left that we see diving in the photo, you see how close the trajectory is. And again, quick comment. I've got the stem. I was able to capture in this image, which I cropped, the stem and sign. Okay? The point I want to make here is look how close this trajectory is. And again, based on the angle, we'd have to go run the math, and the sign has been moved, it's gone. It's very possible that the stem and sign was basically almost in the line of the trajectory of the shot. Something very interesting about the sign, it's extremely low to the ground. Extremely low. When I ran the angle of that shot from Main Street, did the trig, ran it on up the slope, it's right around 50 inches by the time it gets to the stem and sign. So if it's a fragment or it's a high miss, maybe he missed the top of the head, and maybe that's the shot that hit the stem and sign. I've always been puzzled by when you look at the basic placer where the shooters could be, how could a shot hit the stem and sign? It doesn't make any sense that a shooter would be that far off. It has to be a shot that's coming from this direction that we're talking about. Here's the shot past Greer. I'm trying to give you a visual on it. What's interesting, as we know from the Zapruder film, Greer has helped the situation because he has done this and he's opened up that whole view through the window for a shooter. All right, moving on quickly. 3 scenarios. We have an entry in the forehead at the hairline that would possibly look something like this, fragments going out the back. I'm trying to account for where the Belmont fragment would be. I say fragment because I don't believe there's a whole bullet behind the ear. Per Diana Bowron, there's no brain on the right side behind the ear. So if the Belmont memo truly depicts what he was told that there, and I don't think it's bullet, I think it's fragment, it's got to be behind the left ear. It could be something like this. This is the frontal shot in the forehead. This is the shot to the temple, same type of trajectory, fragments blowing the big hole in the back. One travels across It's stuck behind the left ear. And then there's a shot from the rear, which to me doesn't explain a fragment that would be back over on the left side. But it does explain some wounds. We could have, what's interesting about this type, and I actually met, and I'll talk about this in a second, I met with a professor who teaches fluid mechanics because I wanted to understand blood spatter and forward spatter. And we had some dialogue, and I showed him a bunch of this because I'm trying to understand the forces and what you would expect and the directionality of where the spatter would go. So this one actually helps us. That's the hole in the forehead, okay? It's not a frontal shot. It's an exiting fragment. And it also creates the hole in the temple. If you're shooting from the rear, these are various angles. That little black rectangle that you see there, that's the Queen Mary, that's the follow-up car. And when we zoom in, you can see that you don't really have to contend with either of the agents on the running boards when you're basically shooting from the Dowtex position, because you're shooting really right over the windshield, almost straight down range. I've got the head in its proper position, enlarged so you can see it. The entry position on the back of the head is right over the X. The shot from the annex basically would be tangential to a very minor degree. And the shot from the sixth floor is actually viable. That's the red line, if there was a shooter there. The interesting thing about this shot is it could be front to back or back to front. It could enter back by the EOP, and because of the tilt, look how, and again, I've leveled this shot, I've leveled it for the correct slope on Elm, and we're just looking at JFK's position, okay? So the shot could actually come back to front on a downward angle and create the wounds that we just saw, or it could be coming up out of the storm drain. Okay, spatter, it really matters. And when the bullet enters, within a few milliseconds, once that bullet penetrates, spatter comes back. If you shoot somebody in the head from 3 feet away with a .45, you're going to be covered, okay? But the forward spatter is much more significant. Okay, this is what she says, real quick. She believes that the spatter that we see in 313 is back spatter. In other words, it was a frontal shot. It typically travels no more than 4 feet. Now, how do people kill themselves? So when forensically you study this effect, it's either what you have on the morgue table is somebody's been killed with a handgun, or they put a shotgun in their mouth. How many people are autopsied who were shot by a high-velocity rifle shot in the head? I think it's a very low percentage of the autopsies. So there's more that needs to be looked there, because it's possible that you might see, if it was 2,800, 3,000 feet per second with a high-velocity round, you may see more backspatter. She's measured the median velocity of the spatter particles that you see in 313. She says it's 87 miles per hour. Forward spatter from a large exit wound can easily travel 10 to 20 feet. The size and velocity of the bullet defines its energy and momentum. That was confirmed to me by the professor who teaches fluid mechanics. That makes perfect sense. In other words, and back when I showed you the fragments in the gelatin block, the bigger fragments are going farther. They have more mass, more velocity. They have more mass. Cavitation occurs inside the skull, causes tremendous tissue disruption. This force is relieved when the exit wound occurs, and when that wound occurs, it is a massive blowout. Radial fractures emanate from the entry site, and concentric fractures occur. Zapruder's movie film had a shutter that was open for 25 to 27 milliseconds. She says about a 40th of a second. Then it closes for 28 milliseconds. So we have 18 frames a second, but what's happening is the shutter's open, the shutter's closed, the shutter's open, the shutter's closed. So how far does forward spatter moving at 87 miles an hour travel while the shutter's closed for 28 milliseconds? It travels 43 inches. if it's a higher velocity bullet, more energy, and they were also going into a 15-mile-an-hour wind, so we had 15 miles per hour, maybe we look at 120. That spatter coming out the back of Kennedy's head would go 5 feet before you would even see any of it in frame 314 or the subsequent frame. What I'm suggesting is the very split second, in fact, when you see 313 and the spatter that we see in 313, that bullet has entered the head, but it hasn't exited the back of the head. But I think you get the point. Shutter open, shutter close. So it's conceivable in these calculations that anything coming out of the back of the head, by the time that we could see it, it might have gone 5 feet. And it's also going like this. It's going in a cone shape, right? So it's so far back, are we able really to pick it up? Okay, the reason I went and saw the professor is I did this experiment last fall. I called Casey, told him about it. I took a garden hose, I put it on about halfway, had a full stream coming out. I took a paint stirrer stick, I cut a notch in it, I jammed it up against the hose and stopped the flow. And then I slowly moved it down to where that notch exposed. Where do you think the water went? Where do you think the spray went in this picture? It went exactly as I've drawn it. It literally, in this experiment, it goes dead right at about a 45-degree angle. Okay? So what I'm suggesting is when the back of the head blows open, the first piece that goes, wherever it goes, determines the directionality of the spray for the first part. Okay? So it could explain why a frontal shot that's coming from the south that hits Kennedy, if the Harper fragment blows first, that spray is probably going to go more towards Hargis based on this type of thing. Okay, real quick, clearance over the Queen Mary for the shot from behind. Did some analysis. You can see how close their visors, look how close the visors are on the presidential car. Very narrow, pretty close together on the Queen Mary. There's still a gap there. I've got the spec on that. It was a Series 62 Cadillac. I tried to do some math based on this. My calculations as I played with this, Bronson wasn't quite level, at least the way you see the image. He was actually tilted almost a degree further. When you measure the slope in this picture, it's not 3 degrees, 9 minutes. It's basically 4 degrees. So I adjusted for that. I did my best visual image to figure out the trajectory to clear over the top of the visors on the Queen Mary. And I ran it back to the Dow Tex, and you're at 30 feet above sidewalk. Okay? That's just above the second floor windows. So it'd have to be the third floor. We need a better image of this, and we need, as researchers, to recheck this math, but I've got it a little bit too high for the second floor. Larry Hancock has an interesting little piece on Dallas Uranium and Oil. I always found this fascinating. This is a mystery company that was in the Dow Tex building. We don't know a lot about them. But what happened was, when you call the phone number in the book, it rings into the 6th floor office of Morty Friedman. Actually, it's the Maryland Belt is the only thing listed there, okay? Larry has talked to Friedman's son. He said not only did he have some space on the 6th floor, he had space on the 2nd and 3rd floors. This is the guy who's connected to Dallas Uranium and Oil. He's kind of got the run of the building. All right, city directories for 1963 and 64. This is who was in the building. The only people that moved out after the assassination were on the 5th floor, Ed Will Fashions. They left for some reason. Everybody else is still there. Zapruder's on the 4th floor. That's his business, Jennifer Jr.'s. And of course, Dallas Uranium, 6th floor was where the phone rang, but again, they could be on the 2nd or 3rd. All right, the 3-shot scenarios, Doug Horn and David Mantic agree there were 3 shots. They both agree there was a shot down in the back by the EOP that came forward. There was a frontal shot. They think this hole in the forehead at the hairline, they both say that's an entry wound. And it went to the back, exited the back of the skull. Neither one of them commit to shot from the back where it actually exited. Horn says that bullet or fragments may actually have been in the skull and removed. None of them commit to that exit. They defer on the third shot from the right front. Mantic on the right has it coming in the temple, exiting right around the midline of the back. That shot could exit right where the House Select Committee had, where we saw that beveled hole at the top. Horn gets interesting. He says it's a tangential shot, hit behind the ear and literally sliced off the back of the skull. If I remember correctly, was it Humes, Robert? Somebody had tangential it might have been in the autopsy report or it might have been in the House Select testimony, but they talked about a tangential wound back there. Okay, Geneva Hine was in the second floor office. She's the only school book depository employee who didn't go down. When she gives her testimony, she says the building vibrated and it sounded almost like cannon shots. They were so terrific. So she's telling the truth. This gets interesting. Here's the second floor. She's in that bullpen area in the middle. She walked around the counter and she came to that window on Houston and looked out. The motorcade is coming up Houston. When it turns on the Elm, she never sees anything. It's that car, the presidential car is turned before she hears the shots, but she says they sounded like cannon shots. If she's telling the truth, those shots probably came from the Dow Tex, and you can see how the sound gets trapped in between the building. And as close as those buildings are, with a high-powered rifle, it would be something to behold. So I think there's some validity in that. This was my one and only FOIA request. I was turned down. I was working on another project related with some of what the House Select Committee did. And in the middle of this report, the second line, you request the following document, Garinther Moreland Study Technical Memorandum 1066. It was actually quoted in a committee hearing. They denied my request. I appealed that. I said, this was presented in a committee hearing at the House Select Committee. It's in the public domain. So then they gave me the document. What I want to point out is it gets into silence. This is a tremendous document. It's very, very technical. I'll share it with anybody who wants to know. Rifle silencers, suppressors, and they tested, I think, 3 different suppressors, various guns. I think they did it at Aberdeen, if I remember correctly. It reduced the noise 37 decibels. That's about a quarter, about 25%. You still hear the shot. Here's the interesting thing. At short distances, if it's a supersonic round, the crack of the bullet will mask the muzzle blast. And the reason being is that through their testing, if those 2 sounds get to the person's ear within 50 milliseconds, you can't discern between the 2. Okay? The muzzle blast is coming from the end of the muzzle towards you at the speed of sound, 1,125 feet per second. Supersonic round could be coming at 2,800 feet. It gets zipping by long before the muzzle blast ever gets to you, and it's like a wake of a boat. It goes past you. The trailing sound wave is like a V, just like a wake. So when it gets past you a little bit, all of a sudden the wake hits you, okay? That's when you hear the crack. And if you're close enough within 50 milliseconds, and you can run the math, you can't tell where the shot came from. Add into that all the echoes off the... No wonder people were confused.
What we really need is.
Okay, I got 2 minutes.
We're way late.
2 minutes.
Okay?
Okay. This chart, I'll make this PowerPoint available and anyone wants to look at it. This has got bullet information, muzzle velocity, energy, all of that. And it's helpful to do this kind of analysis. All right. Last couple slides. This is looking down right up what is now riverfront. It was industrial. The little yellow circle is the intersection commercial industrial. It's about 1/3 of a mile from the Texas School Book Depository. The downtown Lincoln Mercury dealership is in that oval. That's where Albert Bogart Oswald did the test drive in early November. That's where the nefarious Jack Lawrence worked, who parked a car up at the depository, came back all muddied, ran into the men's room and puked. The Jiffy store is in the red circle across the street, and when you blow that up, and that building is still there today, that's the viaduct. That's where all the water from the west end of Dallas drains out. And what happened the morning of the assassination at 9:30, Oswald comes into the Jiffy store. He gets carded. He shows his driver's license. He buys a beer and pico brittle. Comes back in 10 minutes, buys another beer. So my question is this some sort of a meetup that was going on, okay, that morning, a few hours before the assassination? It's just very interesting, and it ties to the whole storm drain thing because it's in close proximity. Plus, when Sergio Acacia Smith, when they went into his apartment, they found blueprints of the storm drain system in Dallas. So this all kind of ties together. Okay, so the bottom line is we've got to figure out where these trajectories came from, and this is the $64,000 question to end this presentation. Kellerman said there was debris all the way over the front of the hood to the ornament. If he's correct, and they're going into a 15-mile-an-hour headwind, if he's correct, that has to be forward spatter. It has to be shot from behind. I have that calculation. It's got to be at least the third floor in the Dow Tex. As I said before, this hole in the forehead, what they could have easily said, that was an exit wound. So when you go back and review this presentation and you look at these possibilities, this is the last one, the shot to the temple. And in 1967, when he wrote 6 Seconds in Dallas, Tink Thompson had 2 shots simultaneously, one from the back, one from the forehead, okay? So, if this is the back shot, okay, and it creates the forward hole, and he's also shot maybe something like this, which would explain the Belmont fragment, you only need 2 shots to explain everything. What Diana Bowen saw, the Belmont fragment, the holes, the spatter, because this shot creates the forward spatter that goes to the hood ornament. This explains the blowout on the back of the head in the Belmont fragment. So maybe, after all, Tink was right, although I know he just changed his position. That's my presentation. It's a lot of stuff. If you want it, I'll make it available.
One question, David. Go. Brooks, what do you make of, have you studied the Tom Wilson stuff? What do you think?
Quite a few years ago. It's not, I'm going to be 69 shortly. This head can only handle. I think what happens is I'm like a computer. When I start stuffing stuff in there, okay, I've got to remove stuff because the file cabinet is full. So yeah, I studied that several years ago. I think it's very interesting. I can't recall exactly the point he was making and how it ties into this, but
There's a book written.
I have the book. I have the book. Yeah, I have the book.
Wilson well.
One other comment I want to make.
I have an opinion, but
If you believe Tosh Plumlee, he's over on the South Knoll
yeah, I know Tom.
with Sergio Acacia Smith trying to abort the assassination, and he claims they smelled gun smoke, that there was a shot fired from over there.
I got pictures of a gunman over there, and it's right where you're putting the guy.
I think there's a gunman there. There's 2 in the storm drains. There's probably 2 or 3 in the Dow Tex, maybe 1 on top of the annex. There's probably 6 shooters involved at least.
Rick and I figure there's at least